Good afternoon, everybody. It's very kind of you to be here today. This is a day that is not a very happy one for us, as you know. It comes against the backdrop of several events that are marked by either tragedy on the one hand or a total political bias and destructive moves on the other. In Gaza, the massacre of 61 civilians is an ongoing tragedy. It comes in the aftermath, of course, of several issues. One is the movement of the American embassy to Jerusalem and the Trump administration's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in violation of international law and the requirements of peace. And a blatant show of bias, and in a way that would lead to the destruction of the chances of peace, the elimination of the U.S. as an even-handed peace broker, and its inability to play any role in that pursuit of peace. And at the same time, they becoming complicit with Israel in the occupation itself, in land theft, in illegal annexation of territory, which, according to the, as you know, the Rome Statute, is a war crime. And in case somebody didn't tell the American administration, they should be very careful what they condone and what they are party to when it comes to annexing occupied territory and violating Security Council resolutions. This is one. The murder of civilians is not the responsibility of leadership or any political party. The Palestinian people were protesting. It was a grassroots movement, and it continues. They were demanding the right to return. The right of return is enshrined in international law for all refugees. They were also demanding the lifting of this debilitating and cruel siege of Gaza to be able to lead a minimal normal life, even under occupation. And they were protesting, as I said, the American moves on Jerusalem. So, in a sense, it's very disingenuous and misleading to find in Hamas a convenient scapegoat and to blame the death of civilians and the death of innocents at the hands of the Israeli military on Hamas. These were the people who were acting on their own, who were protesting on their own land. And therefore, it is, the last I heard, the people who were shooting, the people who were using sniper fire, the people who were using drones, tank shells, are the Israeli army. And therefore, the Israeli army has to be held responsible squarely, and not to try to find excuses for these horrific murders and to try to blame the victim as usual. And at least the representative should have had the decency to stay or to stand up or to acknowledge the victims and not to walk out. And again, not to blame the victims. This has to stop. That is why we are seeking real solutions. We are not attempting to find any kind of pacification or any kind of economic peace or any kind of taking steps that would make peace that much more difficult. And I don't see by any logic how taking Jerusalem off the table would be a stepping stone to peace. It would be a total annihilation of peace. This is one. And attacking the refugees and attacking UNRWA and withholding funding is also another way of destroying another building block of peace, because the refugee question is crucial, especially in the 70 years since the Nakba. If you don't solve the root causes of the Nakba, you will not have a solution. So that is another issue. And of course, we did not choose the 67 boundaries. It was a global decision that there should be two states on 67. To us, it was a painful compromise. We recognized Israel, we accepted the two-state solution, and now Israel is busy expanding. And when people talk about Israeli borders, I would like to ask Israel what its borders are. Israel is the only country that has no borders but expands at will on other people's lands. And its expansion is on Palestinian land. It is not on Israeli land. And it expands as it goes along. And this has to stop again. So the question of Israeli sovereignty over its own land is very much in question because the West Bank is occupied, Jerusalem is occupied, Gaza is occupied, and these are all Palestinian territories that must be restored to Palestine if there is to be peace. I would like to thank all the countries who have expressed solidarity, countries that have recalled their ambassadors, beginning with Turkey and others, and some European countries, Ireland, Belgium. There are countries that are not easily intimidated by the U.S. or by the threats of the U.S. representative to take down names. And I believe that the international community can be counted on so far still to do what is right. That's why we have asked for international protection and looking into the various means available in accordance with the UN regulations and precedents available. We have asked for an independent commission of inquiry to come to Gaza and to actually issue a decisive and objective report as to what's been happening, because Gaza has been the target of unbridled Israeli violence for so long. And this again has to stop. We are also referring a case to the International Criminal Court on the settlements issue in accordance with the Rome Statute, as I said. And we have signed our accession to several charters and conventions and organizations. This is not a punitive measure. This is our right. It is our right to be a member of the international community, and it is our right to seek intervention and protection by the international community and to ask this community to respect its own legislation and its own charter and regulations. So it is indeed a very sad day, but at the same time, it is time that the Palestinian issue is dealt with on the basis of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. I will be glad to take your questions and move from there. Thank you.
Dr. Ashrawi, welcome to the United Nations. On behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, we thank you for this press opportunity. My name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, correspondent for South African Broadcasting. A couple of questions for you, and just a correction. The first country to withdraw its ambassador was not Turkey, it was South Africa. Yes, so I wonder, does the PLO find such actions useful? In addition to that, Ambassador Haley of the United States in the Council yesterday talked about those who suggest that the Gaza violence has anything to do with the location of the American embassy in Jerusalem are sorely mistaken. Rather, the violence comes from those who reject the existence of the State of Israel. Can you address that specific point? And also, as a final question, is the two-state solution dead?
Oh, these are serious questions. Yes, I think the PLO certainly finds the withdrawal, the recalling of ambassadors a very important step, because first of all it signals to the Palestinians that they're not alone. It signals to the international community that there are laws and rules and regulations that govern the behavior of civilized nations that have to be respected, and it sends a message to Israel that it should be bound by these rules and regulations that dominate civilized behavior if you want to be a state among other states within this global collective. It's extremely important, and we call on all the Arab countries to do that, all the Organization of Islamic Conference to do that, and any country that understands the importance of taking a stand when there are violations like this, because it means that you respect the global rule of law and that there is accountability for Israel. The main problem is Israeli impunity and lack of accountability for Israel. I mean, don't get me going on Ambassador Haley. Really, I think it's extremely difficult to find any relationship between reality and the words we hear coming out from the American representative here. If the supreme provocation of extracting Jerusalem from the heart of Palestine, from the core of any peace initiative, if that is not provocation, if that is not the cause for protests, when the Palestinians see the end of any chances of peace, when they see the blatant bias and lawlessness of the annexation of the city of Jerusalem, which is a Palestinian city, to Israel, and then saying that these protests, does she know the Palestinians more than we know ourselves? That these have nothing to do with the American moves? When on December 6th, President Trump decided or announced that he's going to move, that he's going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, till now, 155 Palestinians were killed protesting peacefully such a decision. More than 12,000 were injured, and many of them are going to suffer disabilities as a result by the Israeli army, protesting the American decision. This is the human toll so far, let alone political and legal toll, of this irresponsible, reckless, biased, dangerous American decision. And to claim that these protests have nothing to do with the American decision means that there is a total disconnect with reality. This is extremely dangerous. And what did you?
The state of Israel, the recognition of the state of Israel, she was saying that's what it's about.
Oh. Well,
State of Israel.
it seems
two-state
again
solution.
that this is a disconnect with reality. In 1988, we recognized the state of Israel, our PNC, which is the Palestine National Council. And we entered negotiations on that basis. In 1993, there was an exchange of letters in which President Yasser Arafat recognized the state of Israel to live in peace and security, the right of Israel to live in peace and security. So that should be enough for anybody who is a member of this international community. You cannot attribute motives. You cannot decide on your own what the reasons are for these protests. Hamas, as an organization, and certainly the Palestinian people, as I said, are not a push-button people. They don't get instructions from above to do to protest. These are, as I said, grassroots, spontaneous moves, and they are mainly run by civil society, by independent people, by people who are driven to protest, to reject such an unfair and unjust reality, and to try constantly to find Hamas as a convenient scapegoat and to blame Hamas for everything, because they have labeled Hamas as a terrorist organization. Therefore, all Palestinians are terrorists and all Palestinians act at the behest of Hamas and so on. This is not only entirely untrue, but it is misleading, and it is a way of avoiding dealing with the truth. And this total disregard for human rights, for human suffering, this total acquiescence to a continued bloodbath in Palestine, and to continued impunity for Israel, and to continued lawlessness and criminality, this cover for Israel, has led the Palestinians to think that Israel has two representatives in the UN, not just one, and one of them even more adamant than the other. So this is extremely dangerous language. Now, the two-state solution, Israel is bent on superimposing Greater Israel on historical Palestine. We accepted the partition of Palestine. It was a painful concession that we made. We accepted Israel on 78% of our land, of historical Palestine. Now Israel wants to take over all of historical Palestine. And that is how the two-state solution is being destroyed. While everybody is talking about direct bilateral negotiations between occupier and occupied, Israel is acting unilaterally to annex more land, to steal more resources, to demolish more homes, to carry out ethnic cleansing, to annex Jerusalem and transform the character, the history, the culture of Jerusalem, and to render it into an exclusive city. And by the way, I have another comment about statements that for the first time Jerusalem is open to all three religions and they respect freedom of worship. Not a single Palestinian is allowed to enter Jerusalem unless he or she has a Jerusalem ID issued by Israel. Nobody from the West Bank or Gaza, be it Christian or Muslim or atheist or whatever, can enter Jerusalem. Not just to worship, but to go to hospitals, to carry out trade, to visit family. Because Jerusalem is besieged and enclosed by a whole, a horrific, actually, wall, apartheid wall of separation. You've seen it. By rings of settlements around Jerusalem and by multiple military checkpoints that treat people like subhuman species, I don't say animals, to get to Jerusalem. And nobody can. So don't tell me there's freedom of worship. Don't tell me when the extremists go around, destroying church property or writing graffiti on walls or spitting at monks and nuns that this is freedom of worship. Don't tell me when they start targeting the holiest shrine, Haram al-Sharif, Masjid al-Aqsa, and they are there daily in incursions on Haram al-Sharif, that they are not provoking a religious war by showing total disrespect for other people's religions. And the government and the municipality are there watching. So all these claims, I hear all sorts of language that have nothing to do with reality and what's happening. We're there, we live there, we see what's happening. And it's unconscionable. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanan. Talal Haj from Al Arabiya and Al Hadath. I'd like to ask you concerning the meeting that happened today in Cairo for on ambassadors level for the Arab League, but most importantly about the foreign ministers level, which is being held in by Saudi Arabia tomorrow for the. As a Palestinian, what would the Palestinian people would like to see the Arab do, beside the statements of solidarity and condemnations in practical terms? What would the Palestinian people expect and want the Arab nations to do? And my second question, you talked about requested the Palestinians to have an inquiry, independent, transparent, in the events of Gaza, and also to have protection for the civilians. But with all due respect, Dr. Hanan, that this is not going to happen unless the Americans have a change of heart in the Security Council. And as for the ICC has been looking into Palestinian cases for a long time, and until now, they haven't even done a preliminary examination. That's been taken forever and ever. They're looking into Afghanistan since 2008, and until now, they haven't finished because, and we all know why, of the crimes that took place in Palestine. How much faith you have in the ICC, really?
Okay. I'll start at the end. It's not a question of having faith in the ICC per se. It's a question of trying to maintain a global rule of law and all the instruments and bodies that should act responsibly and to hold countries, individuals accountable when they violate international law and other people's rights. So it's not up to, we're not the ones who give it credibility. They should give themselves credibility. And we know how many of these international organizations have acted on the basis of external pressure and interest. And there are certain interests by major countries that have interfered and that have affected the work of such international bodies. We have been working with Bensouda for a long time. The civil society organizations have provided her with full information. Her office has all the files, all the documentation, actually more than they can handle on all the violations. They have them. And they have been engaged, as you said, in a preliminary investigation that has taken its time. Now, if the accused belonged to another continent or another color or whatever, then I'm sure it would be much faster. But still, we will persist because we believe there has to be accountability. You cannot constantly treat one country with exceptionalism. You cannot treat it as a country above the law. You cannot give it all these powers and freedom to act in ways that would undermine the global system as a whole. So yes, we now, in referring the issue of settlements to Bensouda, this means that the ICC has to move, and has to move fast, that you cannot prolong a preliminary investigation for a long time. Now is the test. We'll see. We have referred this to the ICC, and we will see if they are going to move to respect and to safeguard the Rome Statute that describes settlements as a war crime. And there are individuals throughout the history of Israel who have been guilty of war crimes. And they are known, and there's enough evidence to have a very compelling case. We don't have to have faith in all these things, but we have to challenge them. And the same thing when we talked about protection and commissions of inquiry. Yes, there's a body, there's a whole long history and traditions. We have UN resolutions that have never been implemented. We know that, but it doesn't mean we give up. We have a full record, and we will continue, and we will continue to press and to challenge all these organizations to carry out their duties. The Palestinians should never be deprived of the protection of the law, and Israel should never be exempt from respecting the law, and we will continue to do that even though it might become tedious and boring for some people. But it is our right, and it is our responsibility to try to challenge the conscience of the world to get some protection for our people and to break through all these myths of misconception, all these misdirections, all this language of deception that you hear to try to hide the truth. We have to get the truth out there. As far as you said, yes, I think it's important for the Arab League also to implement its own resolutions. The foreign ministers meeting tomorrow, and of course the Council on Human Rights will be meeting Friday, and we hope that they will send an independent commission. We expect several things from we are an Arab country, from the Arab League, and including the issue of holding countries accountable that recognize the State of Israel. This is that recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This is a decision they took in 1980, and they repeated it several times, 1990, I think, and 2000, and it is time that they take steps against countries who have done that. Now, we are not unreal. We know the relationship between some Arab countries and the U.S., and we know that they're not going to hold Israel, the U.S. accountable. But there are countries like Guatemala, for example. Why exempt Guatemala and other countries that might be thinking of following in the footsteps of the U.S.? This is, again, another illegal move, and this is a direct affront to the Arab world, to Palestine, and to the global rule of law. So I think that they should also respect their own decisions. They should act politically, and they are acting, of course, in this body here. Kuwait has acted, and other countries have been very effective in terms of pressing the Palestinian cause, in terms of also presenting a unified Arab position on this, regardless of what you hear from discordant voices here and there about their voices. We also rely on the Arabs for economic assistance and cooperation. Not all of it has been forthcoming, but some countries have been quite consistent and persistent in support. And I think especially Gaza, that has become a humanitarian disaster and might not be habitable pretty soon, that there has to be a massive infusion of funds for the reconstruction, revitalization of Gaza, since it has not been reconstructed since not just the Israeli attacks of 214. It's not a war, it's a unilateral concerted attack on a defenseless population, but also to 11, to 12, to 8, to 9. There's a series of attacks from which Gaza has not recovered. And therefore, if Gaza is to survive as part of Palestine anyway, then it needs a massive infusion of funds, of restructuring, and lifting of the siege. The political support and pressure that we need is extremely important, and again, to send a message to the rest of the world that the Palestinians are not alone and they are not fair game, as always. This can find expression in different ways, including not just decisions and statements by the Arab League, but also in terms of political and economic moves. I'll take one there. I can't see. Yeah.
Benny Avni of New York Post. You're talking about help from outside for Gaza, but the leadership in Ramallah has frozen salaries to Gaza. There's clearly some issues between those two leaderships.
Mm-hmm.
And yesterday I asked Ambassador Mansour, he said it would be renewed today. Will it? But more broadly, is this situation right now in Gaza, these events of the last few days, are they going to be helpful or hurt the attempts at reconciliation between the leaderships in Ramallah and Gaza?
Yeah. Yes, I think that any measures taken by the leadership in the West Bank that adversely affect the lives of Palestinians in Gaza must be stopped immediately. We have taken decisions, we have asked for these steps not to be taken, and we are now calling for compliance. We need to help the people of Gaza, not punish them. It's enough that they are being punished by the Israelis. It's enough that they are under siege and under a cruel blockade, and they are being shelled and bombed regularly. And by the way, they are protesting on their own land, not in Israel proper. So you're right, it should be stopped. And the rift should be stopped. We need to have reconciliation and we need to have reunification. And this has been a major source of weakness within the Palestinian body politic. And we have to work on it, and we are working on it. But I was talking to the Deputy Secretary General this morning, and I believe that the people of Palestine are moving much faster and more decisively than the leadership of Palestine, to be blunt. On the ground, you see the young people, grassroots organizations, civil society organizations, people who are acting together, who refuse to see any factional flag, who refuse to deal with any faction, who want to work together as Palestinians. And this is the defining element of these protests. You don't see any flag, any other flag. It's only Palestinian flag. And you don't see any factional politics. You see people actually there camping. You see people dancing. You see people studying. You see people reading. They're saying this is our life, our rights, and we're claiming our power. And I like that. I like the fact that the Gazans and the Palestinians in the West Bank as well are calling out for reconciliation and for reunification, and in many cases are not waiting for their leadership to do so, but are doing it on the ground. And I think if the leadership does not rise to the challenge, that they are losing credibility. They have lost, many of them, credibility as a result of this. So,
But do you think it will happen?
I think that these moves are sending a clear message that reconciliation is not a luxury, it's an imperative. And it is not a political game. This is something that has to do with the lives of people. This is a question of survival. This is a question of facing the tremendous challenges that all Palestinians face, whether in Gaza or in Jerusalem or in the West Bank or even in exile, and even many of them within Israel proper. The Palestinians in Israel, the indigenous population who stayed in 48, are the ones who are suffering tremendous discrimination, systematic and legal discrimination, economic and so on, against their lives and rights. So Palestinians, regardless of the nature of their oppression, have to be able to work together in order to come up with the power, the empowerment to be able to withstand all these various challenges that they face, and to add to it now the absolutely irresponsible decisions and steps taken by the Trump administration. Okay, there, and then I'll move back here. Yeah.
Yes, Stefano Vaccara, Radio Radicale in Rome and La Voce di New York. You just mentioned before the conscience of the world. Of course, the conscience of the world was shaken seeing what happened in last days in the border between Gaza and Israel. But my question is, the conscience of the world could be even shaken more, and I will say that then the cause of the Palestinian will become invincible if those protests are the strategy of those protests. It becomes the one of the total no violence. Means we know the experience of history, Gandhi and so on. You can win the most powerful power, like Great Britain at the time, when you use no violence.
Yeah.
If the thousands of people in Gaza just sit down
Yeah.
and chant or dance, like you say, and no violence at all, you think that the Israeli soldier could have done what they did?
Of
And again,
course.
they did. Well,
They are
well,
non-violent.
but
Let me
but you
answer
think
this
that the
because-
question is the conscience of the world will
Yes.
have reacted probably in a stronger way. That's the
Yeah, I
question.
heard this before, yes, because people are trying to brand whatever Palestinians do as being violence. The Palestinians protesting in Gaza are protesting non-violently. If you see the smoke and the fire, this is on their own land in order to create a smoke screen so that the snipers wouldn't kill them. And the snipers still do, because sometimes they shoot indiscriminately and kill people. You don't have to be violent to be killed by Israel. Look, we were in the first Intifada. It was entirely non-violent. And what happened? Thousands were killed. Since the creation of the State of Israel, between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians were killed. 75,000 were imprisoned by Israel, to 80,000. So this is a nation that is traumatized by the use of enormous violence by an army, by a military, by the occupation. And yet, in 1987-88, we decided to use nonviolence entirely. And we were shot at, beaten up, people were imprisoned, detained, and so on. And we had several cases. Anyway, the issue is you're always asking the Palestinians to be nonviolent when Israel uses unbridled military violence as well as the violence now of the settlers. And by the way, they accuse Palestinians of using cars as an instrument of killing people. It's the settlers who are using this. And if you look at the statistics, daily there are settlers who are attacking Palestinians, particularly in remote areas, who are running over children and others, if they can, in the West Bank and so on. And the army is the most violent forms of organized assault on a defenseless occupation. In Gaza, a defenseless population. In Gaza, they were on purpose nonviolent. On purpose, they chose to be nonviolent. And they were shot at and they were massacred.
And
because the army knows no restraints. And when they say about this is at the borders of Israel, what would you do if you were under occupation? If Israel says that the Gazans are on the borders, and of course, as you know, Israel has no borders whatsoever and does not recognize borders, then you have the full right. Every country has the right to shell and bomb and kill and destroy anybody that's its neighbor that's protesting on its own land. Where's the logic of that? Why should they do that? They are protesting on their land, and they have the full right to do that, and they are doing it collectively as a form of nonviolence. We've done that repeatedly, and yet we've been met with violence. Daily there are Palestinians being killed by settlers, by the army. Daily violence is used against them, and it takes supreme self-control not to resort to violence, and not to react, and not to lash out to the violence to which we are being
So as a
subjected
follow-up,
every day.
you believe that the protest of the Palestinians should continue to be non-violent?
Of course, we have made a commitment to nonviolent protests. And I personally, all my life, I've participated in nonviolent protests. Doesn't mean I was spared the violence, no. I was subjected to Israeli military violence repeatedly. And I was personally beaten up. I personally had lots of, anyway, it's not my personal story, but this is something that no Palestinian is exempt from, even though we try to remain nonviolent. And when a single Palestinian lashes out, of course the label terrorist comes out, as though living under occupation doesn't give you the right to resist, but that should you resist the occupation, then the military occupation has the right to defend itself against its own victims. That's another story. Please.
James Bays from Al Jazeera.
Yeah.
You said at the beginning, don't get you started on Ambassador Haley, but I do want to go back to her speech at a Security Council meeting about the death of more than 60 Palestinians killed by Israeli snipers. She spent a significant portion of the speech talking about Iran. Your reaction to that? And secondly, I wonder if you could expand. You very briefly touched on what's happening on Friday in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, where there isn't vetoes and permanent members. Mm-hmm. Tell us what you expect from the Human Rights Council on Friday.
Okay. Well, it's quite difficult. Look, Ambassador Haley thinks that you are guilty by virtue of your identity. Remember when she refused, she stood against the nomination of Salam Fayyad as a representative of the SG. And she constantly, takes position against Palestinians, individually and collectively, because she said anything to do with Palestinians would be anti-Israeli. So the mere fact of our existence is anti-Israeli. We just happened to be there when Israel was created on our land. We didn't choose for it to be created on our land. So our mere existence is seen by Ambassador Haley as being anti-Israeli. And of course she threatened and she pressured and she used coercion and so on at the UN, particularly by taking down names. I don't think people appointed her the school mom of the world. I couldn't believe the language anyway, but still. I always say, the age of colonialism is over. You cannot use the language and the attitudes of colonialism. And people of her, origin should understand that, because the U.S. is a country of immigrants, of diversity, of pluralism, and you cannot start labeling groups and people and religions and so on, and excluding them. But on the question, there is a total disdain and disregard for the value of human lives when it comes to Palestinians, and we have seen that. There is a total devaluation of Palestinian rights. We've seen that from the pronouncements, not just of Ambassador Haley, but also in the White House. And look, Friedman even tried to drop the term occupation from the lexicon. He thinks that this is, Israeli land given to them, to the Jews by God. And I don't believe that all the Jews of the world agree with him on that. There are many who are supporting Palestinian cause and who are struggling for Palestinian independence and freedom and human rights. So anyway, talking about Iran is a favorite pastime right now because, again, the last I've heard, it was the U.S. that walked out of the JCPOA. It was a multilateral agreement, and the people who walked out were not the Iranians. But again, Israel, in the same way as the neocons and Netanyahu pushed for war on Iraq, they pushed for the withdrawal from JCPOA, and they are targeting Iran as the enemy, and therefore the U.S. has to act in step with Israel. Had these protests happened in Iran against the regime, then these people would be brave, heroic people struggling for democratic rights and so on. But because they're Palestinians, demonstrating against cruel military occupation, they are the terrorists and they are responding to Hamas, and Israel can do no wrong. Again, it is changing the conversation. It is refusing to deal with the realities on the ground, with the occupation itself, the illegality and the impunity of the occupation. And it's attempting to give Israel a free pass, as always, and protection from any kind of accountability or censure. When it comes to the Human Rights Council, yes, certainly we have pressed for a neutral, independent, even-handed commission of inquiry. As always, whenever we ask for commissions of inquiry or human rights investigation and so on, Israel objects and obstructs. They've prevented all rapporteurs from coming to Palestine. Now, when it comes to Gaza, maybe they can go through Egypt, but they will not be able to go to Israel because Israel does not cooperate with any commission of inquiry. At least when you have an independent body like that, then they can try to give you a report that is persuasive and that is not part of the attempts at distortion or diversion or creating other issues, but to deal with the real issues. So that's one thing we want. And of course, we want them to continue, not just to monitor, but to urge to take steps. Like we believe that if you are a member of the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention, that you should have been meeting. You should have urged this body to meet in order to ensure respect for the convention. Not to discuss applicability, but to find means of enforcement. This is what we need. And that's the political will we're constantly challenging all bodies to exercise, to use, in order to play an effective and constructive role in this tragic situation. One more at the end.
Yeah. How you're talking about Israel obstructing independent investigation. So, do you see it playing a role in obstructing the ICC preliminary investigation? Thanks.
The preliminary investigation has been taking place, and there was a committee that was sent, and I think they saw the Israelis very briefly for that, but I don't know what they came out with. They were asked that they would not pursue any kind of active or in-depth investigation that would lead to any punitive measures. I think that's as far as they cooperated. But Israel is not a member state, nor is the U.S., but they exercise influence from outside the ICC. And I don't think that Israel has at any point really cooperated with anybody that sought to investigate its actions or behavior or to hold it remotely accountable for its violations. Yes. Yeah. No, behind. Okay, then the last question was...
Thank you. George Baumgarten, correspondent for Jewish newspapers in North America. Thank you for this press conference, Dr. Ashrawi. I'd like to address myself in particular to the people not just demonstrating within the territory, within the boundaries of Gaza, but the people trying to break down the fence and enter the state of, as you call it, Israel proper.
Yeah.
What would you, keeping in mind that the influence of the institution of nonviolent protest, what would you expect of these of the Israelis when confronted with this kind of invasion? Would you expect them to just line up in two rows and wave hi, or how would you expect them to deal with these people entering their territory?
Yes, first of all, if you look at the map, the fence, the barbed wire fence you're talking about, is on Gazan land. It's on Palestinian land. It's not even the boundaries of Israel, because Israel raised and went into Gaza and cleared up the land and told the Palestinians of Gaza they have no right to enter that territory. So they're not even getting into Israel proper, so to speak. And look, even if a few hundred unarmed civilians, even if, suppose by some remote, miraculous chance they managed to get into Israel, well, they never have done that. Anyway, it's an empty land there. There's no reason to shoot to kill. There's no reason to kill unarmed people. There's no reason to kill civilians when they are clearly just trying to protest on their own land. And I don't think, I mean, if you want Israel to defend its boundaries, I would like to ask you to have Israel define boundaries. The moment it does that, it means the 67 lines, it means that Palestine has its own boundaries. It means that Jerusalem is occupied territory. But because it doesn't want to acknowledge the concept of limits, whether territorial limits or limits to moral behavior or limits to violence, it can get away with it. But it is time that Israel is held to limits in all aspects, including territorial limits. And I think that the shoot-to-kill policy has another purpose. It is not to defend its boundaries, because there are Palestinians within Israel. There are Palestinians who come and go all the time. There are Jerusalemites who can go to Israel all the time. There's no defending its boundaries and so on. This is just an excuse to continue these extreme measures against the Gazans and to tell people that protests don't work. Peaceful protests don't work. They will be met with enormous violence. And this is something that is counterproductive, because many of the things that Israel is doing, by the way, will backfire within Israel.